Thanks, Roger. Thanks, Ovik. That was a great way to kick off the Solutions Summit, and it's just begun. We have our small business minimum wage session now, which, as I told you, was fantastic yesterday in Tri-Cities. So you're in for a real treat to learn more about this issue. That's a big issue that Erin Shannon, who's our director for small business, has worked on. But before I bring up Erin, I want to bring up Gordon Prouty, who's the publisher of the Puget Sound Business Journal. I mentioned they are our media sponsor for today's event. Great partnership with them. We love it that they run our op-eds through the year, and just wanted to bring up Gordon for a minute or so. Gordon?
Good morning, everyone. I don't want to take away time from the panelists on small businesses. That's what we like to cover. But I do want to say on behalf of our team at the Puget Sound Business Journal, I want to thank Dan Mead-Smith and everyone with the Washington Policy Center, not just for hosting this important event today, but for all the work that they do all year long. Their commitment to improving the lives of Washington State citizens by providing accurate, high-quality research for policymakers, the media, and the general public is important. And it's a commitment that the Puget Sound Business Journal shares. We share that commitment by providing local business information you need to help you grow your careers and your businesses, and we're proud to be a part of the 2015 Solutions Summit. This upcoming legislative session is an important one for the future of our region and for our state. And it's critical that the local business community and business leaders be aware and involved in public policy issues, making events like this so important. I do want to take a little bit of a self-serving time and thank those of you who are in the room, and I've seen many of you this morning who are subscribers to the Puget Sound Business Journal. We appreciate your ongoing support. Those of you who aren't subscribers, I want to encourage you to stop by our display table. You can pick up a copy of our most recent weekly edition. It features an interview with Seattle Mayor Ed Murray, but it also features an op-ed, as Dan alluded to, from one of the Washington Policy Center board members, Matt McElwain. So we also have a special subscription offer for you today, so I encourage you to stop by and pay a visit. Again, I want to thank everyone at the Washington Policy Center for allowing us to be a part of this. I hope you all enjoy today's event, and I encourage you all to stay aware and involved in public policy issues. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Gordy. And here is Erin Shannon, our Director for Small Business, for the next panel.
Great, thank you, Dan. Good morning, everyone. As Dan just mentioned, I'm Erin Shannon. I'm the director of WPC's Center for Small Business. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Center for Small Business, our mission is to research, analyze, and promote public policies that we believe will improve our state's small business climate. Now, there are a lot of things that we can talk about, a lot of issues when it comes to improving our small business climate, but the issue that everyone is talking about right now is minimum wage. What impact increasing our minimum wage will have in Washington State. So we're going to kick off our panel with a presentation from Michael Saltsman. He's a research director at the Employment Policies Institute. His writing on the minimum wage has been published in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the New York Post, and the Chicago Tribune, among other papers. He's a frequent commentator on labor policy issues on MSNBC, CNBC, Fox News, CNN. And today he's going to present some of the data about the minimum wage, and who earns it, sort of separate the facts from the fiction and from the rhetoric. After Michael's presentation, we'll introduce and bring out our other two panelists, Howard Behar and Taylor Hoang, and we'll follow the panel with a Q&A session with the audience. So if you could hold any questions until after the panel concludes. And with that, Michael Saltsman, thank you.
So Dan said you're in for a real treat. I don't have a minimum wage themed song and dance for you this morning, but I do have about 25 PowerPoint slides, and so if that's what you consider a real treat, then yes, you are in for a real treat. So I'm out here from Washington, D.C. I manage something called the Employment Policies Institute. You can find us online actually at minimumwage.com. I think we bought that domain 20 years ago, and I know the unions are still smarting that we've got it instead of them. But if you go there, you'll get the actual facts about the minimum wage as opposed to some of the spin you might hear elsewhere. And so what I want to do this morning, just to sort of set the table for this discussion, is talk a little bit about what the political and public opinion dynamic is nationwide on the minimum wage right now, respond to a couple of the worst arguments, the most sort of specious arguments that we hear in favor of raising the minimum wage, and then talk a little bit about, at the end, about what Seattle means for the minimum wage debate. So we'll get started here. The political and the public opinion environment. The minimum wage, especially in 2014 and going into 2015, is entirely a political issue. I mean, the reason we heard so much about the minimum wage last year is that the Democratic Party wanted to use it as a wedge issue in key races to make sure that the conservative or free market candidate put their foot in their mouth. And so that's why we saw in states like Arkansas the minimum wage on the ballot there. It's not because there was any particular interest in Arkansas raising its minimum wage, but they were hoping Tom Cotton would stumble over the issue. So here's where we're at, right? Here's the New York Times a week ago. So minimum wage increases go into effect in 20 states as well as the District of Columbia. We now have 29 states around the country where the minimum wage is above the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. Depending on how you look on it, this does one of two things. It either takes the pressure off of Congress to do anything on the minimum wage because the states are acting. But the other thing it could do is actually increase the incentive for Republicans to make a deal, because as more states raise their minimum wage, there are fewer and fewer Republicans in Congress who actually care if it goes up because their constituents are already paying a higher wage. Across all states right now, the average minimum wage is about $8.30 an hour. So it means you could raise the federal minimum wage by about $1 an hour, and there's a lot of Republicans that really wouldn't care. So this is actually this morning here as we talk, the AFL-CIO was holding its national summit on raising wages. They held it in Washington, D.C. at Gallaudet University. And the point of this summit, well, the AFL-CIO will have its own reason what they think the point of the summit is, but the real point of the summit is to make sure that the minimum wage remains a political issue in 2015 and into 2016. You know, for those of you who are following the kind of the political horse race, there's a concern that Hillary Clinton might be too moderate of a Democratic candidate, and so right now the role of people like Elizabeth Warren and of groups like the AFL-CIO is to make sure that these wage issues remain something that the Democratic candidate has to campaign on, and ultimately something that the Republican might even be willing to compromise on. You know, Jeb Bush is the Republican frontrunner essentially right now, and he's got a brother and a father that both signed minimum wage increases while they were in office. And so it's not unrealistic at all to think that a Republican could try and embrace this issue or at least neutralize it going into the 2016 campaign. So what's happening now, right? So we know there's a political debate that's taking place in the minimum wage. Both houses of Congress, though, controlled by Republicans in 2015, unlikely you're going to see a bill move. And so what happens? You're going to see a lot of the action move to the city level. Labor unions and a lot of the groups that they fund have realized that it's easier to count to 10 or 15 or 20 on a city council or in a local legislature than it is to try and get the votes passed at the national level. And so a lot of the focus has been going after the low-hanging fruits, the Seattles, places like San Francisco, places where they feel like it's relatively easy to get a group of people who are already really on board with raising the minimum wage, and it's just sort of a conversation about how high do we want the number to be. And so that's where the debate is heading going into 2015 and 2016. And real quick, two of the factors that are driving this, and I think these are things that, if you want to sort of talk about water cooler conversation, or at least the kind of issues that continually bubble up on newspaper opinion pages, is that we're having an economic recovery, but that a lot of the jobs seem to be service industry jobs. Now, if you're someone who's a proponent of raising the minimum wage, this becomes an argument for why the minimum wage needs to go up. We're creating lots of jobs, but they're low-paying jobs, and so the minimum wage needs to increase. The other issue is this inequality issue, right? So here's Mr. Nick Hanauer. He wrote this piece for Politico a couple of months back, and this is sort of typifies the inequality narrative that we're hearing a lot. That yes, there's an economic recovery happening, but it's only benefiting a select few. CEO pay is coming back, corporate profits are coming back, but that people at the other end of the wage scale are not finding themselves being lifted up as well. And so that is one of the other issues that is defining this push to raise the minimum wage. So that's a really brief overview of the public opinion environment, and I wanted to walk through real quick some of the common arguments you may hear, especially as, if there's a statewide debate now on raising Washington's minimum wage. These are some of the arguments that you're going to hear most often in favor of raising it, and I wanted to just provide you with some pointers on how to respond. So this is the first one, no job loss. It's sort of a political truism that, if you're going to attack your political opponent, you don't go after their weaknesses, you go after their strengths. And what proponents of the minimum wage have done is, after years of being clobbered with the true fact that raising the minimum wage causes job losses, they decided to invest a lot of money in research of their own to try and make the opposite case. And so there's a handful of research centers around the country, at UC Berkeley and at UMass Amherst, that have been churning out these papers, flawed papers, but papers nevertheless, suggesting that you can raise the minimum wage and it won't cause job loss. So a couple of responses to that. I've kind of sort of had the three-part response because I think it's important to make sure you hit all the high points here. The first is this, and let's see if here we go. So it is true that there are some studies out there showing that a higher minimum wage does not cause job loss. But those studies are vastly outnumbered by studies showing that it does. And so if we're just going to talk purely in terms of consensus, 85% of the credible journal-published research on this topic from the last 2 decades suggests that if you raise the minimum wage, you're going to cause job loss. So you have the empirical research on your side. But these things can devolve into a battle of the studies. I have a number of friends that work as reporters. They're getting press releases all the time from both sides trumpeting their new studies. Sometimes it's sort of, you kind of want to split the baby and say, well, 6 of one, half dozen of another. Maybe it'll come out somewhere in the middle. So this is the second portion. I should have done a different picture of this because it's closer. But this is a billboard we put up in San Francisco that basically said, San Francisco, meet your minimum wage replacement. And it's an iPad that says, hello, may I take your order? And the point of this kind of messaging, and we've done this elsewhere, and we've talked to reporters about this a lot, is that it gives people a very tangible example of how a higher minimum wage actually does kill jobs. It's not this amorphous thing where somehow businesses sort of cruelly decide, hey, we're going to eliminate half of our workforce and work understaffed for the rest of the time. There are actual practical ways that today you can use something like an iPad to replace servers. You can go into a Chili's restaurant today and you can place your order via one of these Ziosk tablets, and they can have 2 servers manning a table section that used to would have required 4 or 5. So that's sort of the second step. And the third step is the personal anecdotes. So this is a restaurant in Hillsdale, Michigan called Taste of Life. I grew up in Southeast Michigan, and I still have a lot of connections in the state. And I traveled there recently to spend a day talking to Taste of Life, the pastor who started it. It's a nonprofit restaurant, and the employees who, until September, worked there. When Michigan's minimum wage increased, Taste of Life, which operated as a nonprofit restaurant for people who were formerly incarcerated, people who were struggling with addiction and health problems, they couldn't handle the increased cost, and so they had to shut down. They had 12 employees, some of whom it was their first job out of prison, 12 employees, 4 of whom were able to find work, 8 of whom still have not been able to. And so I think the importance of stories like this is that it takes the empirical studies, it takes things that are numbers, that are charts and graphs, and makes it into a story that people can relate with, they can resonate with. Because if there's a critique I have of opponents of a higher minimum wage, it can be sometimes we get so confident in our intellectual arguments that we forget that there are real flesh and blood people who are affected by this on both sides of the debate. And so I think it's crucial to have these stories included in any response to a higher minimum wage. So here's another argument you hear a lot. The minimum wage has not been properly indexed for inflation. That if you went back to 1968, which was, has been declared the minimum wage's heyday, the historical high point when it was above $10 an hour, that this is what it should be today. And so if it's what you could do in the late 1960s, why can't we get there in 2014? Now, the problem with this argument is that it's kind of a cherry-picked argument. I think the most intellectually consistent historic reference point for the minimum wage is when it was created in 1938. And if you went back to 1938 and linked it to inflation to today, it'd be about $4.19 an hour. So if you went to 1948, it would be about $3.92 an hour. If you went to 1988, it would be $6.50 an hour. Even in 1996, during the Bill Clinton years before the federal minimum wage went up, it'd be about $7.15 an hour today. So what this suggests to me is that pointing to 1968 as the reason why we need a higher minimum wage is nothing more than sort of an arbitrary, somewhat of a historical anomaly that really doesn't prove anything other than it's possible to pick a year that gives you the right minimum wage that you want for ideological reasons, not economic ones. So here's another argument. Now, this is one you heard in Seattle a lot. This is one we hear a lot from Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren, that the minimum wage is not reflective of productivity gains, that the economy, people are more productive. You're surrounded by this in Seattle. People have computers in their pockets now. But at the same time, workers' wages in the service industry aren't keeping up. And so what I've had to talk reporters through is that there's actually a really good reason for this. So if you look at productivity economy-wide, it's been chugging along at a pretty good pace as we've been making rapid productivity gains over the last 2 decades. In the food service industry, it looks very different. You can only clean a table, you can only cook a burger so fast. And so what you see is small or non-existent productivity gains over this 2-decade period. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to link a minimum wage to overall economic productivity as opposed to productivity in industries where it actually applies. And so this is the last one I'll address. Again, there are any number of arguments we could talk about, and I'd be happy to talk to any of you if there's one particular argument you're eager to hear a response for. But this is one we hear a lot, is that large corporations are employing people at the minimum wage and they can afford to pay more. We have CEO salaries that are so high and that there's no reason the minimum wage can't go up. And there are a number of problems with the argument, but the one thing I'd point out is that if you actually look at the minimum wage workforce, about half of the workforce actually works at businesses with fewer than 100 employees, and about 40% actually works at businesses with fewer than 50 employees. So it's, and if you look at sort of the other end of the graph, about a third work at large corporations, 1,000 or more employees. And so it's not at all true to say that raising the minimum wage is just going to stick it to the big guys. What it's really going to do is stick it to your local diner or your local grocery store or your local retailer, because they're the ones who are doing a lot of the hiring at or near the minimum wage. So just a quick thought in the coming debate on Seattle. You may think that the debate on Seattle is over with because the law has been passed. The debate on Seattle is just starting. Seattle has now become the public opinion flashpoint for whether or not a higher minimum wage, specifically a $15 minimum wage, is viable elsewhere. And here's what you're going to start seeing in the not too distant future. I'd be willing to bet some serious money on this. So, San Jose raised its minimum wage in 2013 from $8 to $10 an hour. A year later, proponents of the minimum wage looked not at the people who were affected by it, but they looked at overall growth in the city of San Jose. They said, hey, San Jose is still chugging along. That must mean that the $10 minimum wage didn't have an impact. We've seen very similar things in San Francisco. San Francisco has had the highest minimum wage in the country at $10.74. It's now going up to $15 an hour. The same folks who we talked about earlier at the University of California, Berkeley, looked at overall employment growth in San Francisco, compared it to surrounding counties, and said, hey, looks like the minimum wage isn't having much of an impact, so that should be our go-ahead to keep raising it even higher. The same thing will happen in Seattle. You can mark my words on that people will look at overall employment growth in Seattle. They won't look at the people who were actually impacted by it, and they will say, look, this is proof that you can raise the minimum wage. And anecdotes are going to hurt you too. And I mean, I don't mean to single anyone out too much, but anecdotes like this one. There was a big public opinion debate over SeaTac and what would happen when the minimum wage went to $15 an hour in SeaTac. And what happens sometimes during these public opinion debates is people say things not just about the real consequences of the minimum wage, but they go a little further. And when things like that happen, and then after the minimum wage increase goes into effect, business expansion still takes place, people start to think that a $15 minimum wage is not that harmful after all. There's a lot of nuance to the minimum wage debate because it's always been an issue of who's it's going to hurt and who's it going to help. And if the people it's going to hurt are the young, the less experienced, the people who are less educated, specific service industry businesses, then that's where the focus needs to be. And so if I was going to suggest a to-do list here for Seattle, it'd be two things. There are businesses in Seattle, and in fact, you'll hear from one of them today. There are businesses in Seattle that are going to be affected by this $15 minimum wage. They're going to be harmed. And so two things need to happen. The consequences need to be documented, and then those stories need to be told in a way, not just in Seattle, but nationwide, so that other people understand that there is no free lunch here, that Seattle is somehow not removed from the economic reality that seems to apply everywhere else in the country. Because if that doesn't happen, Seattle will be what San Francisco was to healthcare mandates and paid sick leave. It will be the jumping off point that allows this idea to be exported to other cities and then eventually to other states around the country. And I think the consequences are going to be tremendous. And so I'll close with just this video to give you a sense of what these stories can look like. This is an organization called the Doe Fund in New York City, specializes in getting formerly incarcerated men back into the workforce. I think these are the sorts of stories that have to be told in Seattle.
Before coming to the Doe Fund, I was incarcerated.
I spent the last 20 years of my life in prison.
I wasn't here. I was probably dead or in jail.
The Doe Fund was started at the height of the homeless crisis in New York. We've always believed in the basic principles that America is built on. Hard work, personal responsibility. People need to learn the soft skills of how to go to work, of being responsible, of showing up, of getting educated. You can't do that if jobs don't exist. The perception from those of us who work with the poorest people is that if you raise the minimum wage, businesses will not hire people. There is nothing we can afford less in America. Nothing than less jobs and less opportunities.
Raising the minimum wage hurts those who are most in need. Find out more online.
So I'll close with that. Those stories are out there. This was a train ride to New York City. It was a day's worth of filming, and this is the sort of thing now that is used to talk to New York City legislators about why a $13 or $15 minimum wage in the city of New York might not be a good idea after all. Those stories are out there, and I think now in Seattle that you have a unique opportunity to be able to educate the rest of the country about why $15 is not the kind of Washington state export that they would be interested in. So thanks.
Thank you, Michael. Next, I'd like to introduce entrepreneur, restaurateur, consultant, and chef Taylor Hoang. Taylor has really been at the forefront of the effort to educate Seattle's policymakers on the unintended consequences of that city's new $15 an hour minimum wage. During the debate that led up to that wage, she really emerged as the voice representing the immigrant community and minority small business owners. And last but not least, Mr. Howard Behar. He's the former president of Starbucks North America and Starbucks International. He joined Starbucks in 1989. I think there were about 28 stores, and they'd just begun to venture out of the Pacific Northwest. And during his time at Starbucks, he helped grow that company to the global icon that it is today. He also helped establish the renowned Starbucks Business with a Conscience culture, where employees are called partners and they enjoy very generous benefits and compensation. He's also the author of It's Not About the Coffee, Leadership Principles from Life at Starbucks. Welcome, Howard and Taylor. So I'd like to start our panel, kick our panel off with just a question, brief. If I could get a brief response from Howard and Taylor, what should the purpose of a minimum wage be? Should it be a wage that supports a family? Should it be a wage that is provides entry-level skills? And as an employer, what is an employer's responsibility when it comes to ensuring that an employee has a certain standard or quality of life?
Thank you. Thank you for having me here today. It's great to be here and share my story with all of you. For me, as an employer, I have 5 restaurants. We have close to 65 employees. And for me, as an employer, minimum wage is a starting wage. It's a wage that allows me to hire students, college students that are looking for a part-time job during the summer. It's a starting wage that allows me to hire new immigrants to this country, immigrants that have very little skill, that do not speak English, that has no understanding of the work environment or mechanics of working in the United States. It opens the door for me as an employer and my colleagues and other restaurants to hire these particular people that are at a disadvantage. So during the minimum wage debate in Seattle, the proponents had set out to vilify us employers as being irresponsible, that we are greedy, that we are taking advantage of our staff and our employees. And I have to say that that is the opposite of what an employer is. I have staff. I've had my restaurant since for about 13 years now, and I can say that more than half of those employees and staff have been with me on average of 7 years. And in a restaurant industry, that's really hard to find, that you would find staff that's willing to stay with you for 7 years, some even up to 10. Some have been with me from the start of when I started my business. So as an employer, most of the time, you will find employers that perhaps do take advantage of their employees. But for the most part, we are here to be responsible employers, to give a start to people who wouldn't otherwise have a start. And we want them to grow with us. We want them to be a part of our family. And so minimum wage for me is a starting wage, is a wage that opens the door that otherwise would not be there for a lot of people.
So I agree with Taylor. The minimum wage is, if we all remember, my first job was at Jeffco. Anybody remember Jeffco? Okay, I got paid $1 an hour and I wasn't worth it. Okay, and then I got a raise to $1.25. You know, I mean, I was making $10 a day. That was incredible, right? And I thought I was rich at that time, you know. And minimum wage jobs are introductory jobs. People are not meant to stay in those kind of jobs for 5 or 10 years unless their wages are going up. And the stories that we read about people that have been with certain companies doing minimum wage jobs for 8 years, I'll tell you, then there's something wrong with that person, that they would stay there. And I'm always curious about where those people are going to go if those jobs aren't there. And, you know, Starbucks never paid minimum wage. It was one thing that we didn't do. We were always above minimum wage for lots of different reasons, and so we didn't want to deal with that issue exactly. But minimum wage jobs are supposed to be introductory jobs. They're a chance for young people to get into the workforce to make a little bit of money. They're not meant to be living wage jobs. And we've had minimum wage jobs, I mean, probably for centuries, maybe in different terms, but the same thing. People that didn't have skills, immigrants, people that couldn't speak the language, young people, whatever it happens to be, were able to go to work and make some money and help to offset incomes in their families. But this idea that they're supposed to be living wage is ridiculous. First of all, $15 in Seattle isn't even living today. If you have to rent an apartment by yourself, you couldn't support a family on $15. You know, unless you had 6 people all working to do it. But so, you know, this idea that it's supposed to be a living wage, I think, is a fallacious assumption.
So there's no arguing that some employees, some workers likely benefit from a $15 an hour wage. But what are some of the trade-offs?
Well, you know, there was this great argument in Seattle of how much the minimum wage was going to lift the economy. And, you know, I don't have a college degree, but I was trying to figure out, how does that work? Okay, I always wondered how +1 and -1 together can equal plus anything. I think it still comes out to 0. And so I was talking to one of the people that was proponent of the minimum wage increase, and he was telling me how much this was going to lift economic activity in Seattle because all these minimum wage workers would have so many more dollars to spend. And I said, well, aren't prices going to go up because of minimum wage? Isn't that going to take some money out of somebody else's pocketbook? And he said, yeah, that's true, and I guess really it doesn't, but that's the story that we're telling. I said, well, so who's going to pay for this? And I quote, he said, it's all the Amazon workers that are making all that money. They're the one, it's what he said, that are going to make that money, that are going to actually pay for this. I mean, it was the first honest answer that I'd had from anybody. So, I mean, minimum wage jobs, they're meant to do something, get people into the workforce, but they're not going to do the things that everybody thinks that they're going to do. It's just impossible. It doesn't work that way.
So I'll share a story with you that kind of puts into perspective the unintended consequences of raising the minimum wage. I have a couple that works for me. They've been in the U.S. for about 3 years now, and both husband and wife works for me. He works part-time because he's going to college. He's going to a technical school to get educated. He was an electrician in Vietnam, so he wants to get his electrician license here. And when, during the debate, they came to me and said, well, we want to cut our hours. We don't want to be paid the higher wage. And the result was that when she is working for me, she's right now at $10.50. What happens is that they lose a lot of subsidies that they are getting from the federal and the state, not from the city. So, for example, she has 2 young kids, and they get subsidies for preschool. But as soon as her wages is raised, she goes from paying $300 for her childcare up to $800. So there's a $500 gap per child that she has to pay, so $1,000. And the amount of wage that I can give her an increase is not going to be enough for her to cover for her children to be in preschool. And her husband also loses his subsidy for the technical college. So he won't be able to get that license. He won't be able to eventually in 2 years or a year and a half to get his electrician license and move up to a different working environment. So both of them came and said, well, we need to stay within this amount. So there's a lot of unintended consequences that is not shared, and the city of Seattle is not giving these benefits. These benefits are coming from the state and the federal government. So you're going to see a lot of people dropping out of the workforce in order to keep their benefits, because $1,000 difference in childcare is not going to be made up by an increase in her wage.
There's one other thing. I was just a survey. How many are willing to pay $10 for a latte? Okay, I doubt that many of you will, and I'm not saying that that's going to go up to that, but I can tell you from a Starbucks perspective, and although I'm not there anymore so I can't speak for them, I ran the numbers and I said, what would Starbucks prices have to go up to pay for this $15? So here's the number as best as I can tell you. Right now, the average sale at Starbucks is about $5.25 or so. It will have to go to $6.25 in order to just break even. That's just break even. That's no margin on your labor. Now, that means, and labor costs will go from somewhere between 28 and 30% to close to 37%. And that, we're going to have price increases across the board. If you come into Seattle, you're going to be paying average of $5 more per ticket for a restaurant meal than you're paying now. There are no free lunches, so to say, on this deal. And there will be less jobs. I can almost promise you, guarantee you, that the talk about using iPads is coming. And if you want to come in and pay cash within the next 5 to 10 years at a fast food place or maybe even a Starbucks, you will not be able to pay cash probably. You're going to have to use your credit card, debit card, or Starbucks card, because they're going to be looking for ways to get rid of labor costs within inside those 4 walls, and that will be one way they do it. Can you imagine not having to worry about cashiers ever or making change? Significant reduction in cost, and it'll be advantageous for them even if they lose a small percentage of business to people that want to pay cash. It'll be advantageous for them to not take cash. So those changes are coming. There's no way around it.
Well, that sets us up for my next question for Michael. Can you kind of help paint this picture of what these entry wage jobs begin to look like, or lack thereof? You know, the Department of Labor, they say about half of the 30 largest growth occupations through 2022 are the low-wage, entry-level type jobs. So what does a $15 minimum wage mean for those jobs? I've heard, you know, I'm reading things about a burger flipping machine that can cook 360 burgers, you know, an hour.
Yeah, that's right. So it's not something out of the Jetsons. There's a company in San Francisco called Momentum Machines that actually has created a burger flipping robot that replaces 3 full-time kitchen staff. And it doesn't look like a little thing that walks around like R2-D2. It basically looks like an assembly line factory thing that, you know, kicks out the burgers. But we actually, you know, it's funny if you were to broach this issue with reporters, even as recently as 2009, 2010, it sort of felt like a Brave New World scenario. But what has happened in the intervening time is in Western European countries, for instance, McDonald's has made the decision where the minimum wage is closer to $11 or $12 an hour to do exactly what Howard is talking about. They've replaced cashiers with these touchscreen kiosks where you do receive your burger after typing it in on the computer. They're testing it in certain markets right now in the United States as kind of like a high-end customizable burger alternative, but it's coming here. I think the changes that you see in full-service restaurants, I think, is again indicative of where we're going. But even if you go back a couple of years, I mean, you could go all the way back to, Denny's making the decision to leave the pot of coffee on the table instead of having someone come around and refill it. I mean, that's a labor-saving device right there. Pumping your own gas is a labor-saving device. What these technology changes have enabled is that the customer's experience anymore does not change dramatically. Placing your order via that touchscreen device doesn't dramatically change your experience. Someone is still coming to the table, but what it does is it hollows out the sort of the opportunities that existed at the bottom rungs of the career ladder that allowed so many of us to work our own way up. It allowed me to bust tables and then to sing songs at Johnny Rockets and pay my way through college, right? I mean, these are the opportunities that previous generations had that future generations will not if we keep moving on this path.
And you got tips.
And I got tips. That's right. Actually, great tips, because I'll tell you what, singing Aretha Franklin's Respect, that was like my specialty at Johnny Rockets.
Taylor, could you tell us a little bit? I know you have some compelling stories, and as an immigrant business owner, you've really dedicated a lot of your business towards helping fellow immigrants. Can you kind of give us a little bit of, tell us a little bit of your story of what that unintended consequence is going to be, that $15 wage for what you currently do for them?
So for me, usually what I said is survival of the fittest. So if you go into, so in 2012, there were Seattle generated about $2 billion in restaurant sales and revenue, and the largest sector was about 14% of that $2 billion, and that sector was owned by immigrant restaurant owners, minority business owners. And so it's a huge population. It's a large chunk of that revenue comes from minority businesses. And most of these businesses employ immigrants, whether they are Chinese, Vietnamese, Cambodian, Hispanic. At my restaurant, we have about 70% of our staff are immigrants, Hispanic, Vietnamese, and Chinese as well. And the unintended consequence is that these new immigrants will lose their jobs. They will not be able to get jobs. Typically, an immigrant that arrives in the city, we have people that come to us after 3 weeks of being in the country. They have very little skill. They don't speak English. They don't even know how to take the bus. They come and ask for jobs through referral of family members or friends that are currently working for our company, and we hire them. But when we hire them, it doesn't mean that we let another person go, because it takes us 3 to 6 months to fill the gap, to get them up to speed and training in whether it's with the health code, working machineries, even our staff taking them under their wing, showing them how to take the bus system, where to go get their ORCA cards, or just places that they can drop their kids off for preschool or daycare. So it takes about 6 months to bring them up to speed in order to the point where they can now be on their own without someone taking them under their wing and training them. So the unintended consequence is that when I am put in a position of hiring someone with that inexperience, or hiring someone with a lot of experience at $15. The choice would be to hire the 15 experienced workers at $15, because at the inexperienced employees, it would take 2 of them to do the work of 1. So the unintended consequence is that you're going to see a lot of immigrants, and Seattle and Washington State has a large influx of immigrants that come into the state, that they are going to lose jobs. They are not going to be able to get the opportunities to get their family out of poverty, or to move their family up to a point where they can earn a higher wage and a living wage.
There's some other unintended consequences. How many people do you think that distribution is going to move out of Seattle and King County? How many people think that manufacturing is going to move, light manufacturing to move out? Because it isn't just the $15 at the minimum wage. It's what happens the rest of the way. I'll give you a real quick story. I have my own Starbucks that I go into every day, And I always am joking with the people there, and I said, geez, you guys are going to get a big raise here pretty soon. And one of the baristas who'd been with Starbucks for about 5 years said to me, I'm not getting a big raise. What is Starbucks going to do for me? I'm already making $14 plus tips. He'd been there a while, and so he had good wage increases. But I started to laugh. I said, boy, there it is right there. Because with this new law, here's what's going to happen, right? If you start today at Starbucks, and let's say we're at $15, and it's going to go up. Somebody that starts 5 years from now will be, when minimum wage is whatever it's going to be, will make exactly the same wage that you make. If you are doing a good job, there will be no money to reward people that are doing a good job because it's tied to inflation, and most companies don't grow faster than inflation. You know, you're lucky if you do. You're a good company if you're doing that. So we're going to be giving wage increases tied to inflation every year. That means most companies take that bucket, that inflation bucket, 2%, 3%, whatever it happens to be, and spread it across all their employees. Somebody right now gets 4%, somebody gets 3, 2, and maybe 1, and somebody gets 0 is out of there. That won't happen anymore because everybody is going to be making the same thing. And it is going to be a huge issue that people just don't understand that's coming. And, you know, these things take a long time to play out in the marketplace. There's another thing that I want to say. You've got to understand that labor unions, and this, particularly the Service Employees Union, could care less about you and small business. Whenever you hear them talking, or if you hear even your politicians hear the politicians talking about how much they care about small business, baloney. If they did, it wouldn't take 18 months to get a restaurant permit, right? I mean, yeah. So I think the biggest problem we have in our community, in the business community, is we don't act with one voice. We do not come together. We have what I call Northwest guilt. It's kind of like Jewish guilt. I'm Jewish. Same kind of, or Catholic guilt, whatever you want to call it. We don't act as one. We don't speak with a powerful voice. And if you want, the labor unions have a plan. And if you want to read the plan for the Service Employees Union, go buy Andy Stern's book. What happened in Seattle came out of this book. Well, almost word for word, you can read it, right? And it'll tell you where they're going. The next thing that's coming up on the agenda, right, is no part-time work. That you got to give your people more hours before you can hire another person. It's what they did at SeaTac, and I guarantee you they're going to try to do it here. I think they already tried to do it in San Francisco. They passed it. Can you imagine that? No part-time work. So your kids, forget it. If you think your kids are going to be able to find jobs at 16 and 17, it isn't going to happen.
So I know I want to kind of try to tie what happened in Seattle to perhaps what is coming for the rest of the state. And I know the business community has been fairly critical of the process of the $15 an hour wage in Seattle. One business representative said, you know, his service on the committee was, it was a sham and a charade. And now we have at the state level lawmakers who are beginning to say, well, we've got to get in front of this, a $15 an hour wage, so we're going to start offering up perhaps legislation for a $12 an hour minimum wage and try to cut the best deal that we can. What should be the process for increasing the minimum wage? Is it something that should be done unilaterally by a city council or a legislature, or is it something that that voters should have the final say on, as we did back in 1998 when voters passed Initiative 688 that increased our state's minimum wage, made it the highest of any state in the nation, pegged it to inflation, annual increases. What should be the next step?
Well, I've always believed that businesses not only have responsibility for their own business, but they have a greater responsibility, and that's to the communities in which we live. And the communities in which we live include minimum wage workers, includes everybody in the community. So we have to, number one, take that responsibility. But I think that businesses also have a responsibility to communicate about the issues that are affecting them, because you're the ones that are creating the jobs. So I always believe that we can trust the voters. Do we all get it right all the time? No, we don't. But we can't trust voters. But in the city of Seattle, we had a mayor and we had a union that basically got together and jammed this thing through. And they did it by the mayor appointed the people that he wanted on these committees. It was a total sham from beginning to end. Some of the people that were on the committee were beholden to the city. One that owns the Space Needle, one that got $3 million for one company that got $3 million for the interruption with the seawall, and they couldn't fight against it. So I think that this is not something that should be decided by a small group of people. It should be decided by the people of the state of Washington or the people in the cities in which they live. We can trust each other to do the right thing given the facts of the case, and then we can make good decisions. But to have a few people who are politically motivated to make those decisions, I don't think is the way that we want to do it, and particularly the way it happened in Seattle. Don't let it happen here on the east side.
I was very involved with the discussion in Seattle, and I think that as business owners, like Howard said, we need to be much more responsive to get involved, to make our voice heard. And it was very difficult even for a lot of my colleagues. They didn't want to be vilified in the press. They didn't want to, because the union was very strong and it was attacking anybody that came out. They didn't want to be vilified. They didn't want to be seen as not supportive of minimum wage increase for their staff. And for me to come out, it's not that I don't support a better living wage for my staff. Like I said, most employers are very responsible employers. And so it takes a lot of guts and a lot of, sense of responsibility to come out and talk about it. The process in Seattle was not an inclusive, like Howard said, process. I think that if it was more inclusive, including the voice of small business, of minority business owners, of more nonprofits, because nonprofits is going to have a lot of consequences for them as well. To be involved in the process would probably turn out differently. And also, the process was very ugly. I was very involved in it, and I have to say it was very ugly. It was my first foray into politics, and it wasn't a nice experience. So I think that the people should have had a chance to vote on it. We weren't allowed that chance. We were not given that chance. And I think that if any city can learn from it, it's to give the people a voice on this.
So you'd think that the big companies would get involved, right? The Starbucks of this world, the McDonald's of this world. I talked to the chairman of McDonald's, and I tried to push Starbucks with everything that I could to get involved. They didn't have to say anything. They just had to help contribute to getting an initiative on the ballot, which would have allowed us to vote. But nobody would do anything. The big companies all hid their heads because they were afraid of the public perception in the marketplace. So the truth of the matter is the small businesses got involved. And you know what happened to them? The SEIU put a map out and identified every small restaurateur that had come out against the increase in the minimum wage and told the people that work for the SEIU to boycott those restaurants. And it absolutely scared the hell out of the small businesses. And so you can understand what was going on there. It was absolutely horrendous. But if all of you are waiting for the big companies to come and to say something, it isn't going to happen. They will not do it. They will not take on these challenges because they will get vilified. And the CEO has to stand up and justify how come they earn all the money that they earn, even though it is not the issue. But they'll have to justify it against the minimum wage. And so it has to be small and medium-sized businesses that take on these issues. And again, we've got to speak with one voice. We have to demand of the associations that we belong to come together in a unified voice with a strong economic plan that represents business interests in the state of Washington. If we don't, trust me, the only interests that are going to be represented are the interests of the unions, and particularly the Service Employees Union.
Well, that sort of brings me to my next question. Michael, could you just so we're hearing a lot from Taylor, from Howard, and of course all of these studies about how increasing the minimum wage has, put negative consequences for many, many workers. And of course, labor unions purport to want to help workers, and most labor union members earn above the minimum wage. So could you just really quickly tell us what is the what is the agenda for labor unions in pushing these super high minimum wages across the country?
Sure. So it's there are a couple of reasons why. I mean, there's one reason why labor has historically supported a higher minimum wage is that there are some unions, Food and Commercial Workers Union, the Service Employees Union, that actually do have contracts that are pegged to increases in the minimum wage. Sometimes it triggers a new round of bargaining. Sometimes their salaries are set as a certain percentage of the minimum wage. So there are occasions where there's a direct benefit. In other cases, though, it's part of a broader strategy. Sometimes a law is passed that basically has a collective bargaining waiver, where the only way to get out of this sort of draconian package of legislative mandates is to basically to be part of a labor union. Well, in that case, maybe it makes more sense all of a sudden for the employer to do it. Unions are also engaged, though, in something of a risky gambit, and we see this in places like Seattle, where they're passing these laws limiting part-time employment. Is they're looking for other means to show their value to employees. I mean, we're looking at a historic decline in labor union membership. I mean, under 10% now of private sector employees belong to a labor. I mean, it has been a dramatic decline, and so labor is desperately looking for other ways to boost its membership, and they see some promise in the service industry. Not so much that they love the dues money off an hourly employee, but they certainly love the initiation fees. So they see some promise there, but they're looking for ways in. And so as you hear these discussions about things happening at the National Labor Relations Board, as you hear labor basically trying to pass laws that are essentially collective bargaining at the city hall as opposed to over the bargaining table, these are part of a gambit to try and reassert their relevance and to make themselves once again attractive to employees.
Great, thank you. And with that, I want to go ahead and see if we have any questions for our panelists. We have a few minutes left here, if anyone has any questions. Oh, I see a hand right there, okay. Yes. And if you could wait for the microphone.
This is a question for Michael. When I lived in countries that had very high labor costs mandated by government, what we saw was the economy moved underground. That is, the longer labor rates were high, the more it became just systematic that businesses moved off the books. Do you see that in any of the research? Because what happened here in Seattle is we get a picture of what it looks like today and what it'll look like a year from now, but it doesn't look at what it'll be like 20 years from now, where if wages are artificially high, restaurants and other service businesses will just try to pay under the table, and it becomes acceptable.
So you actually have seen some of that. I think San Francisco is a good example where if you're a medium, or certainly if you're a large corporation, but even if you're a medium-sized business, the risk involved with trying to do anything under the table is enormous. But there are some small businesses, largely cash businesses, where that has been an issue. I haven't seen a lot of research on that, but what I think I can say with certainty is that in some of these other countries you're talking about where labor costs are higher, people over time have gotten used to paying more. I mean, my sister Katie spent a year in Australia where the minimum wage is tremendously high, and people are used to paying much higher prices for the goods and services that they consume. And what I tell people sometimes is that if Americans tomorrow decided that they had no compunction with paying higher prices for anything, the minimum wage debate would be over. I mean, you could raise the minimum wage to whatever you wanted, employers would raise their prices accordingly, and they would be done with. But it's because that tension exists that we start to see these unintended consequences. It's because people are price sensitive. And so whether it's going underground or whether it's the more measurable things we talk about in terms of job losses, loss of hours, this is what happens when you have consumers that like their dollar menu.
Okay, yes. I'm having difficulty seeing. I didn't wear my glasses. All right, this gentleman right here. Oh, right there. Well, we'll do that one, then this gentleman next.
My opinion, and it's a professional opinion because I'm a commercial realtor and I work with a lot of small businesses, and I've been doing it for 20 years. I have clients that are watching extremely closely what's going on. I have two in particular that both have, in one case, 4 operations, the other case, 7. He will not expand. The one is never going to expand in Seattle as it is. If the part-time gets in there, it takes out probably 20% of his workforce. And he cannot raise the rate of his product because then he'll price himself out of his market. He's not firing anybody, but he's not hiring anybody. He'll let attrition take it out, And like I say, if part-time kicks in there, I worked probably like a lot of people. I worked my way through college part-time. And my grace, I worked in a cafeteria. I didn't make a lot of money, but they fed me once a day. For a teenager, that's big money. My parents deeply appreciated these people, believe me, because if I worked until we closed the place, I could eat anything that left over. Imagine telling that to a teenager. And there was 5 of us that did that, so we just sit there and eat like hogs, and then go home. But part-time would kill what I did, would kill a lot of it, would kill the college student, the high school student that many of us started with. In the case of Cedar Brook in SeaTac, they have an ability to do something a lot of the little guys cannot do. They can raise the rack rate. They can bring it up. They can take the hit, because if they get the 63 rooms built and they go at full market, then they can handle it. But like I say, you will have people, and I have 2 clients now, both would like to expand, and they're both in Seattle, and they're both probably not going to expand in Seattle. They will go somewhere else. Thank you.
And then this gentleman was next.
There's a really interesting piece in The Economist about a year ago that's had me thinking ever since, that suggested data from Europe suggests that if you peg the minimum wage to 50% of the median or lower, you help more people than you hurt. But if you peg the minimum wage to 50% or more of the median, you hurt more people than you help. I've been waiting to ask some smart people whether that makes any sense.
Well, I don't know if I qualify as a smart person, but I can take a stab at the answer.
Well, she called me a gentleman, so.
So the United States experience, I can tell you, where we have not historically had a minimum wage that's been pegged there, pegged to 50% of the median. Without getting too much into the wonky details, economists actually have studied really closely the issue of flows into and out of poverty after the minimum wage goes up, because there's been a lot of interest in making sure that the winners outnumber the losers, and actually to try and reduce income inequality. I mean, that's been one of the stated goals of raising the minimum wage. And what you've actually seen is, in fact, you got a guy in California, University of California, Irvine, who's sort of the expert on this. He basically found that a minimum wage increase in the United States has essentially been a redistribution of income among low-wage workers, that some essentially benefit at the expense of others, that those who keep their hours, keep their jobs, are relatively better off. Others aren't. And he sort of totaled it up and actually found that the losers tend to outnumber the winners. And so what it suggests to me, I haven't seen the Economist piece, but it suggests to me that if even in the United States, where the minimum wage is below the median wage, if you get that dynamic here, I would be surprised if Europe was somehow immune from that.
And I think we have time for another question. Right over there.
I want to go back to Howard's point, because I was involved in this in Seattle, and I don't give a damn who calls me on my phone and threatens me. I don't give a damn. But my small businesses have to look at this from the point of view whether they stay in Fremont or go north of 145th. Michael, in our case, Seattle's a very small piece of geography. And so we're competing with the neighborhoods around us. But to your point, I was disgusted with our organizations that are supposed to represent us. And I do know that the immigrant community, my Chinatown folks and whatnot, did more than their heavy lifting, and they got threatened. But the bigger part was our organizations who decided they wanted to be paid to be lobbyists to go down to the state and argue about this. I will tell you, they can argue all they want. They're not going to pass a bill in the state that says the minimum wage is uniform around the state of Washington. It isn't going to happen. They might be able to keep it from going to $12, but that's all they will do. In the meantime, we're going to have this pop up in Bellevue and Spokane and Yakima and every place else, and we're going to have to fight it in these cities where we were a 9-0 city council. It wouldn't have mattered what the mayor said. We were a 9-0 city council. These folks got guarantees from some of the different council members, and when it came to a vote, it was 9-0. So in these cities, we can't win. We need that initiative for the whole state. And we didn't have the backing of our local organizations because they wanted to be paid to lobby.
Sure.
There's a great Margaret Thatcher quote, first you win the argument, then you win the vote. And I love what you're saying, and I think just one comment that applies not just in Seattle, but I think nationwide, is that the minimum wage, especially on these local levels, it is, you know, I have lots of friends who are lobbyists. I actually have respect for the job that lobbyists do, and I think it's important. But these minimum wage battles are ultimately, they're street battles, they're turf battles, and it's the sort of thing where they're not going for the head, they're going for the heart, they're going for the gut. That's why they're putting the employees out there, that they found that one guy in Seattle that hasn't gotten a raise in 20 years. He may be the only guy, but they found him, and now he is their spokesperson. And so when you're fighting these battles elsewhere, I would bias yourself towards going for that emotional argument and not being willing to throw some punches, not being willing to say the emperor has no clothes, because that's what the unions are going to be doing all day long.
Yeah, I think that there was no voice, and I am really critical, particularly of the Seattle Chamber of Commerce, and I say that here knowing it'll probably get me in trouble, but they just copped out of the deal. They just left it alone, and they said they did all these things. They didn't really do anything, nothing. And they didn't represent the businesses in the city, and they needed to do it, and they didn't. And I don't know why, I don't know if they were afraid, but basically the chamber has just become an office of the mayor. And when you have something like that happen, it just destroys any chance we have of making our case. And they did not want to listen at all. The council members did not want to listen. The mayor particularly did not want to listen. And if we're not going to fight for the things that we believe in, and we can fight the emotional case. You know, first of all, most of the people, when you talk to them, we all agreed that it wouldn't have hurt us to have it go up. But any time that you don't take responsibility, or we don't take responsibility for our communities, it's going to get us in trouble. And if we would have probably gotten together and say, what can we do? Because if we're always only going to react, trust me, we're never going to get anything that we want. We have to get in the position of acting as a community. We got to get out in front of things, not behind things. And that's where we were caught. We knew it was coming, and we didn't do a damn thing.
We have time for one last question, right here in the middle.
All right, well, we were involved.
If you could just wait 1 second, we have TVW here, and they won't be able to record. There you go.
Okay, we were involved in the fight too with Dick's Drive-ins, and again, we also pay more than minimum wage, but we're so concerned about, you know, what's going on with people who need that first job, and they're not going to get it. And those are the stories we have to tell. I'm so glad to hear Michael speak, because those emotional stories, Taylor, when you said your story about your employees, we need to get that on Facebook and the web and get that story out there, because a lot of people who think they support this, the guilt people, think they're helping poor entry-level workers. And until we work at the ground level to explain the real story, it's not going to change. And hopefully that's what our organizations can start doing. So I'd love to hear where that's happened effectively, Michael, if you have any anecdotes.
Yeah, what? Yep.
So what I can tell you is that it's an ongoing project. In fact, the Taste of Life thing I showed you from Hillsdale, I mean, I saw that story reported in the Hillsdale Collegian, the college newspaper, and basically made sure that on my next business trip to the Midwest, I had a chance to stop in Hillsdale and film for the day. So the stories are out there, and there are a couple different methods that I'm sort of working on to identify them, because it's not always easy to identify the employees. But I guess I would just say that it takes a little bit of shoe leather. You know, it takes a little bit of being willing to go out, sometimes get on a plane, sometimes get in a car and go and talk to the folks, because they're out there. But it's tough to just find them by sort of sitting in an office and saying, well, where can we find some disenfranchised employees? You got to go look for them.
Yeah. Yes.
just one last thing I want to add to that. It kind of brings back all of the things that we've been talking about. In order to get these stories out, first, the community and both the employers and the employees need to see that the community, the city, the organizations that are around them support them, that they are not going to be out there. I mean, I have friends that she came out and her business was boycotted. She literally had a meltdown after the law passed, and she stayed home for 6 months. She won't go into her place of business now because she was just so disenfranchised with the whole process. So we all, myself, my staff, if you need to hear these stories, first, we as an organization, a community, need to come together, support, have one voice, like Howard said, then the stories will emerge because we know we have support.
I mean, let's take the idea about no more part-time work, right? Why shouldn't we be out in front of that story and going after it now and saying, do you know what the Service Employees Union wants? They want to get rid of part-time work. For all you high school kids, parents, okay, where are your kids going to work if there's no part-time work? And we can prove that they've tried to do it because that's what they try to do in CTAC. So we got to get out in front of things, not behind things, and that's what's killing us. We do not have a voice in this state. Okay, what we have is a bunch of individual voices. And whenever you have a bunch of individual voices, and the politicians can take whatever voice they want to listen to. And if we can figure out how to come together, all the business organizations in the state, and say this is what we think we need to do, and take on the responsibility of watching out for our communities and the people in our communities, then we're going to change the dialogue in this state. Right now, we're all bad people, right? All of us in this room, you are all guilty, right, of providing jobs, really. And unless we start speaking up for ourselves, we're going to deserve what we get.
Well said, Howard. On that, and before we conclude, I do want to just mention, since it was brought up, WPC is working on a series of videos featuring employers and employees, employers like Taylor and some of her workers that sort of tell the story of how they've changed their business model, and as an employee, perhaps how their benefits have changed or their work model has changed to try to help get that message out to policymakers in the state. But with that, we are concluding our small business panel. I want to thank Michael, Taylor, and Howard for a fantastic job.